The shadow of Erebor hung over the northern lands like a quiet warning, a mountain both reclaimed and yet unsettled, its peaks etched with the scars of fire and the memories of avarice. From the lowlands, Lake Town shimmered in the distance, its waters reflecting the first pale light of morning, a fragile mirror to the unease that stirred within men, elves and dwarves alike. The mountain's hollow heart still echoed with the destruction Smaug had wrought, and though silence now reigned in its halls, it was the uneasy silence that follows a storm, the kind that carries both relief and foreboding in the same breath. Thorin Oakenshield walked these reclaimed corridors with measured steps, his gaze tracing the intricate carvings of ancestors long gone, yet present in every stone and relic. Each footfall stirred dust that had lain undisturbed for decades, a gentle reminder that time moves steadily, indifferent to the ambitions of those who occupy its spaces. Within the grand halls, dwarves busied themselves with the careful sorting of gold, silver, and gemstones, their voices low, tinged with a mixture of awe and caution. Some spoke in hushed tones of the dragon that had fallen, while others whispered of the enemies they feared would soon learn of Erebor's renewal. Thorin paused at a carved relief of his forefathers, their stern faces staring down from stone, a silent audience to his determination. Legacy, he understood, was a heavy mantle, and the mountain's treasures carried with them a burden heavier than mere gold. The promise of reclaiming what was stolen was interlaced with the price of pride and obsession, the quiet cost of rulership that Thorin now bore with deliberate intent. Outside, the wind swept through narrow passes and high ridges, carrying news and rumor alike, rustling banners that hung limp in anticipation of storms unseen. Beyond Erebor's gates, the forests of Mirkwood whispered of movements in the dark, the elves sensing shifts in the balance of power. Thranduil's eyes, sharp as frost upon leaves, lingered on maps and emissaries, calculating not just the bounty of the mountain, but the subtle mechanisms that guided alliance and enmity. Each step toward negotiation was measured, each word weighed, for even friendship bore the potential for betrayal. When treasure and honor intertwined, the men of Lake Town, led by Bard, watched the distant smoke of Erebor's chimneys, contemplating both opportunity and responsibility. Their city had been scarred, yet its spirit endured, tempered by hardship, and Bard's hand upon the bow was steady with the awareness that the mountain's shadow would inevitably reach them as well. In the valleys between high ridges, orc warbands stirred, their horned banners glimpsed by scouts and travelers, signals unnoticed by most but recorded in the silent ledger of fate. Bulg, heir of the goblin hosts, moved with calculated intent, marshalling forces that knew only the rhythms of war, oblivious to the subtler calculations of those who held council in stone halls or beneath the emerald canopy of Mirkwood. These movements, though distant, carried consequences that would converge with startling immediacy. The threads of destiny, invisible and intricate, were weaving a tapestry in which every ambition, every vow, and every fear would find a reckoning. Within Erebor, Thorin's fingers traced the edge of a sword long untouched, its steel cold but alive with the weight of history. In the silence, he considered not just his lineage, but the fragile alliances that had formed, tentative and fragile, yet necessary if the mountain's reclamation was to be more than a hollow victory. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a chill from the north that spoke of armies on the march and the inevitability of confrontation. The mountain, for all its grandeur and treasure, had become a fulcrum, poised between the ambitions of dwarves, the vigilance of elves, the resolve of men, and the relentless hunger of darkness gathering beyond the horizon. Even as light crept down the slopes, illuminating spires and battlements, a quiet unease settled in hearts, both noble and wary. Every stone in Erebor, every leaf in Mirkwood, every wave upon the lake, seemed attuned to a fate yet unplayed, a reckoning that approached with patient inevitability. And in that hush, one could sense that the mountain's silence was not peace, but a prelude, a breath held before the clash that would test courage, measure loyalty, and exact its own quiet price. The days to come promised not merely the shaping of treasure and territory, but the shaping of legacy itself. And as Thorin stepped from the shadowed hallways into the mountain's dawning light, he carried with him the full weight of what it meant to reclaim not only gold but a destiny intertwined with the lives and fates of those who had chosen, willingly or not, to answer the mountain's call. The mountain's silence had begun to ripple outward, disturbing the careful balances of distant thrones and weathered halls. As Erebor stirred beneath the weight of dwarven voices and gold-dusted labor, the echo of its awakening reached the deep chambers of Mirkwood and the ruined streets of Lake Town. It was not only the Dragon's End that summoned attention, it was the age-old question of who, in a fractured world, would lay claim to what remained in the smoke's absence. In the forest realm of Thranduil, where light filtered through endless green with a hush older than many kings, the Elven King stood before a long table carved from silverwood, his eyes lingering on a map marked with roads long faded and rivers still true. The news had arrived in fragments. Smaug was dead, Erebor reclaimed, and Thorin Oakenshield had sealed himself inside. What followed was as expected as it was unwanted uncertainty. Treasure unguarded by fire was a kind of wound in the world, drawing claimants like blood draws flies. Thranduil moved with the grace of still water, yet his thoughts flickered like the leaves in autumn wind. The gems once promised by the dwarves, long denied, long remembered, were now within reach. Yet it was not greed that guided him, but memory, the breaking of old pacts. The pride that had driven kin to ruin lingered beneath every political maneuver. Elves do not forget easily, and neither do they forgive without purpose. He sent envoys not in haste, but with the ceremonial calm that only the long-lived can afford, their steps gliding across roots and time toward Erebor's newly lit gates. Meanwhile, Bard of Lake Town stood on the charred bones of what had once been a thriving city. The dragon's death had brought no peace, only ash, hunger, and the haunting weight of survival. And yet Bard, who had loosed the fateful arrow, now found himself drawn into councils and pledges, the reluctant steward of a people who looked to him not for glory, but for food, homes, and answers. Among the ruins, the cold crept early that year. Children gathered near makeshift fires. Old men spoke of legends they never thought to witness. And the gold of the mountain, glittering unseen in the distance, had begun to change the hearts of men as it had once changed dwarves. Bard, weary and upright, knew that hope was not enough. Reparation was needed. Promises had been made by Thorin to share the wealth. Promises spoken before a dragon fell from the sky and before the ancient sickness of greed had awakened once more in stone-carved halls. He, too, sent a delegation, not as conquerors or beggars, but as those who had paid in blood for the dragon's end. With them went the quiet weight of memory, of destruction endured, of a city submerged in flame, and of a people standing now on broken foundations, with only their dignity to shield them from the coming cold. The mountain did not answer. Thorin remained behind iron-bound gates, his voice unheard, his purpose folded inward like a shadow over gold. From above, ravens began to weep. The skies, once disturbed by fire and wing, now bore a different silence, one that traveled fast, carried by feathers and instinct to distant places where old oaths still mattered. Far beyond sight, in stone-spined crags and cold-lit caves, another presence stirred. Orc warbands, long kept to the dark margins of the world, listened to murmurs of wealth, discord and distraction. They needed no invitation. Conflict drew them like a signal fire. But the forces that moved them now were not only savage, there was design behind their hunger. Eyes sharper than steel watched the brewing disunity between dwarf, man, and elf, and saw in it the perfect wound to exploit. Yet these movements remained unseen by those focused on old debts and urgent needs. The delegations from Thranduil and Bard, each unaware of the other's timing, now began to converge on the mountain's feet, their paths threading together across riverbanks and frost-edged roads. Soldiers walked in silence, banners furled. They were not yet an army, but they were not simply messengers either. In the stillness that held Erebor in its grasp, the wind shifted. From the battlements, dwarven eyes marked the approach. Words were exchanged. Gates stayed shut. Thorin, seated beneath a vault heavy with gold, heard the reports and answered not with diplomacy, but with silence. His gaze fixed on the Arkenstone, radiant and unmoving, the mountain's heart beating softly beneath layers of ancient grief. Outside, the delegations pitched camp, no weapons drawn, no words yet exchanged. But beneath the frost and pine, tension unfurled like a banner not yet raised. And so the mountain waited. The world breathed in. Allies stood on the edge of becoming adversaries, and from distant passes, something else watched and waited, its presence still cloaked, but its footsteps already on the way. The land beyond the mountain's reach had begun to murmur, not with words, but with the hushed rhythms of something gathering, something that watched from the high and broken places where no banners flew, where the wind howled through skeletal trees and the stone held old scars. Among the jagged peaks of the north, beneath snow that never fully melted, the orcs stirred, not in chaos, not yet in fury, but with a grim, guided purpose. Bolg, son of Azog, moved through their ranks without speech. His eyes, pale and hard as mountain ice, bore the shape of vengeance. For years they had lingered in shadows, licking their wounds after the fall of the great goblin and the fracturing of their kind in the deep places of the misty mountains. But now scattered rumors had drawn them out, rumors carried by bats, by wolves, by the silent tongues of the dead. Erebor was open. The dragon was gone. Gold lay unguarded in its caverns, and more than that, pride had returned to the stone halls. Pride, the first scent of war. The orcs of Gundabad, long dormant in the north, had sent their messengers in secret, moving by night and under stone. Black-armored wargs howled through ravines, their riders whispering of alliance. Not one horde, but many were assembling, drawn together not by hunger alone but by a command. They did not question. Bolg's orders had not come from instinct. Something deeper stirred behind his campaign. Something old, cloaked, and cold. They moved not with reckless haste, but with eerie discipline, carving hidden roads through ice and rock. Where rivers forked and ancient trails broke, their scouts left signs for the others to follow. Simple marks etched into bark or bone, understood by those who needed no maps. And still, the world watched elsewhere. In Erebor, Thorin obsessed over lineages and riddles of stone, blind to the slow encirclement forming in the hills. In the greenwood, the elves sharpened their blades, their minds caught in memories of ancient betrayals. In Lake Town's ruins, men clutched their cloaks tighter as the wind grew sharp, never suspecting what moved beyond the ridges. The orc scouts moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the movements of others. One band, lean and dust-covered, crouched beneath a shelf of stone overlooking the march of Bard's men. They watched the wagons, the provisions, the slow, heavy burden of diplomacy. Another group spied on the elves' vanguard as they passed through the narrows between vale and mountain. Quietly, invisibly, they reported back, not with parchment or ink, but with tokens passed hand to hand across the wilds. From a high outcropping on the shoulders of Mount Gundabad, Bolg stood in stillness. The sky above him bled to grey, the horizon thick with low cloud. Behind him a host was forming, not yet fully visible, not yet unleashed, but vast and ready. His lieutenants, clad in armor, pieced together from bones and the wreckage of old battles, waited at his flanks. He raised no cry, no battle horn. He simply watched, for now. The mountain's echo had traveled farther than gold could explain. It was the kind of echo that speaks of distraction, of factions turned inward, while the edge of the world hardens its grip. Bolg knew the moment was coming when they would all look too late, when the weight of old wounds and mistrust would make the blow fall faster. His task was not only to break the alliances of the free peoples, it was to ensure they never formed at all. And so the orcs did not march in great fanfare, but seeped through the cracks in the land, like dark water. Villages along the fringes vanished without trace. Herds were scattered. Tracks disappeared beneath the frost. And when the snow came, as it always did in the high places, it covered the signs of war like a shroud. Even so, not all eyes were blind. In the highest places, the great eagles wheeled silently, their golden eyes reading the land below. From their eyrie on the wind-scoured peaks, they saw the glint of armor far beneath the trees, the sudden silence in valleys that once held game and firelight. Their flight paths changed, angled now toward Erebor, not to intervene, not yet, but to observe what others would not see. Back in the mountain, Dwalin noted the tightening supply lines. Fili and Kili, eager yet cautious, reported strange signs on the outer slopes, broken shrubs, scattered bones, the faintest footprints turned to mud and gone by morning. Thorin waved them away, eyes fixed upon the Arkenstone, his mind turning deeper inward. But the scouts who returned from the ridgelines did not speak easily. They were hard men, their hearts shaped by exile and war. Yet something in their silence said more than words could. Something was moving. Snow gathered in the crevices above Erebor, fine as sifted ash, clinging to black stone, and pooling at the feet of ancient statues whose names had long passed into echo. Inside the mountain, firelight danced across golden veins carved into the pillars, their glow dim against the chill pressing in from the outside world. Thorin Oakenshield stood alone in the vast entry chamber, the vault doors sealed behind him, his breath rising in faint clouds. Around him treasure glinted in restless silence, coins, crowns, and cups, all without voice, yet louder by the hour. The mountain had been reclaimed, but it was not at rest. Its grandeur had become a labyrinth of tension. Every corridor now bore the weight of what it held, and what it might yet lose. Thorin had posted sentries at every passageway, doubled the watches at the main gate, and ordered the forges to remain hot not for crafting, but for defense. The sound of hammer and bellows echoed hollow through halls once built for celebration, now turned toward siege. Dwalin paced the northern ramparts, his boots crunching through frost that clung even beneath the stone archways. His eyes swept the narrowing trail that wound from the valley floor to the fortified gate. Below, tents and watchfires from Bard's men and Thranduil's host flickered in quiet defiance of the growing cold. They had not left, nor had they attacked. They waited, and waiting was its own form of pressure. Thorin called these watchers trespassers, their patience a guise for ambition. He spoke less each day, but when he did, it was with a narrowed gaze, and a voice touched by something older than grief. He walked the treasure hoards not like a victor, but like a man guarding a wound. Philly and Killy had noticed the change first. Their uncle's silences were no longer contemplative, but wary, even secretive. He had begun to withhold orders, to brood over maps no one else saw. They found him at odd hours, tracing the edges of the Arkenstone's absence, though he never spoke of it. The missing heirloom weighed more in its absence than any gold in the mountain. Balin, who had once believed Erebor's return would bring healing, now saw the mountain closing in on itself again. The stones sang no songs. The halls had no laughter. There was gold, yes, but it had not brought back the kingdom. It had only deepened its echo. Outside, Thranduil had sent a second message, respectful, but clear. He reminded Thorin of the gems once promised to the woodland realm, a token of friendship never delivered. Bard's letter followed, humbler, yet firmer still. Lake Town's survival had been paid for in Dragonfire, and the gold, they believed, must help rebuild. Neither message received reply. The gates of Erebor stood sealed. From the towers above, Dwalin's archers kept steady hands upon their bows, watching the slow ripple of movement in the camps below. No siege engines had come, no weapons drawn, but the silence itself grew heavier with each passing night. And beyond that tension, beyond the eyes fixed on one another across the valley, something else stirred beneath the snowline. The scouts who patrolled the western ridge had begun to report strange signs, trees torn not by wind but by claw, tracks that vanished at cliff's edge, fires seen from afar, low and fleeting, as if trying not to be seen. Ori had returned from one such patrol with the look of someone who had stared too long into shadow. He said little, only that they should triple the watches along the back approaches. Buffer scoffed at first, but after a night beneath the stars when even the wolves did not howl, he grew quiet. And still Thorin gave no command to parley, no signal to retreat. His mind was wound tighter each day around the spiral of the gold, its weight, its power, its threat. He spoke of oaths, of ancestral rights, of kingdoms built not by negotiation but by blood and hammer. But deep in the mountain, far from the noise of camps and the quarrels of kin, the earth itself began to shift in subtle protest. It was not a sound that could be named, only a pressure, a sense that something was coiling beneath, like a spring drawn tight. The mountain, though blind and ancient, seemed aware. It had seen such patterns before. It knew the rhythm of pride, the pull of gold, the silence before ruin, and above it all the wind began to turn, sweeping down from the north, colder than before. Across the northern marches, the wind had changed. What once had drifted softly from the snowy ridges now came in surges, gusts that carried not just cold, but a strange restlessness, as if the air itself anticipated some unseen arrival. Among the frozen streams and broken hills, the march of the host had begun. It did not announce itself in banners or horns. It moved with the stealth of purpose, its silence more dreadful than any war cry. At first it was glimpsed only in fragments, a raven circling and then fleeing, smoke on the horizon that vanished by dusk. The prints of boots too many to count pressed deep into the frozen soil and then gone by morning. Small villages near the forest's edge had stopped sending messages. Hunters disappeared without a trace. And the few who returned spoke of movement in the deep valleys, of shapes crossing ridgelines at dusk, always watching, never drawing near. The host was gathering under Bolg's command, yet not in a single mass, but in rivers, streams of orcs, wargs, and goblins, winding their way from ruined strongholds and long-forgotten dens, all flowing toward a single point beneath the shadow of Erebor. Each company brought its own history of vengeance, shattered shields from the Battle of the Five Peaks, scars from Moria, exile from the west, and guiding them all was the unspoken will of a darker force, one that had no name in the tongues of dwarves or men, but which whispered clearly in the ears of orcs. Balg himself moved ahead of his warbands, mounted on a pale armored warg whose breath steamed like iron. He did not shout. He pointed. He did not gather followers. They followed by necessity, as stones follow the pull of a cliff's edge. Behind him the frozen land bore his path in marks of scorched grass, uprooted trees, and silence where once the birds had nested. Scouts sent from the elf host had begun to notice. Thranduil, though appearing serene, had narrowed his patrol's ranges, ordering them doubled. The woodland realm had long kept its enemies at bay with precision and secrecy, but this enemy did not fear discovery. It moved without concern for concealment, now only for timing. From the dwarven lookout above Ravenhill, Bifur noted strange glimmers at night, torchlight where no path lay. He spoke of movement to Thorin, but the king dismissed it. "Let them come," he said, his voice distant, "if they think the mountain lies unguarded." Yet Erebor was not ready. It was fortified, yes, but not prepared. Its defenders were proud and few. The forges had been repurposed for war, but no reinforcements had come. The Thorin had sent no messengers for aid, trusting neither elf nor man, and fearing betrayal more than siege. The mountain had become his world entire, and in it only the gold gleamed with clarity. Meanwhile, Bard's men continued their camp below the eastern face, preparing for negotiations that no longer seemed likely. Food supplies dwindled. Snow crept farther down the slopes. The promise of aid from Dale still in ruins was thin and slow. Yet Bard refused to abandon the mountain's shadow. He knew, without proof, without message, that something was approaching. His instincts, honed by fire and loss, felt it in the frost. On the 6th morning of the standoff, a cry was heard from the southern watch. Elven scouts returned breathless, their cloaks torn, their eyes rimmed with dread. They had seen it, just the edge of it, a column of orcs moving through the withered heath, shielded by snow and stone. No banners, no fires, just black shapes flowing through white passes. They would be there by dusk. Thranduil's host readied in silence. The men of Lake Town strung boughs, their hands clumsy with cold but their faces grim. Dwarves along the battlements tightened their grips on axes and spoke less than before. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the crunch of boots on frost and the distant keening of the wind through mountain spires. Still Thorin remained within. He had heard the reports. He had weighed them and dismissed them. To him, the arrival of elves and men had always been the greater danger. The thieves come to steal what dwarves had rightfully reclaimed. That orcs might come as well was to him a lesser matter. For what were orcs to a mountain of stone and flame and fire-forged will? Yet deep beneath his thoughts, something stirred, something colder than fear, something older than pride. Even the Arkenstone, radiant beneath the golden arch of the treasury, seemed dimmer now. And beyond the ridges, hidden by snowfall and dusk, the first ranks of the host began to descend. The valley below Erebor held its breath. Dawn had not yet touched the peaks, and the sky remained a deep gray, stained faintly with the approaching hue of stormlight. The air was brittle, and the stillness had the weight of something waiting to break. Then, without trumpet or declaration, the first blades caught fire in the frost. The glint of steel clashing with iron, the song of skirmish born not from full war, but from collision at the edges. It began with the outliers. Scouts returning from the north slopes failed to answer their signals. Then came the cries, sharp, brief, and choked by distance. Archers on the elven side caught movement among the rocks. Not a line of orcs, but clusters, testing the approach, mapping the defenders, striking at the fringes. They came not as one tide, but as knives in the dark, probing, measuring, fading. Bard was first to react. He ordered sentries posted farther out, even as the men of Lake Town scrambled to form tighter ranks. Their armor, repurposed from trade and ruin, clanked and bit at their skin, but their eyes remained steady. These were men who had faced a dragon and lived, they knew fear, but they had learned to stand beside it. Thranduil's elves moved differently. Silent as morning mist, they shifted into place, their movements graceful and precise, lines reformed, positions adjusted. Theirs was not a defense of noise, but of presence. They knew the forest's edge, and even in open valley, they adapted. When the first orcs broke from cover, they were met not by alarm, but by arrows that found throat and knee before sound could summon scream. The dwarves upon the battlements observed in silence. Dwalin leaned against the parapet, watching the dance unfold far below with eyes narrowed and jaw set. Not a full assault, he muttered, a reckoning of numbers. He had seen it before in the Blue Mountains, in the dark days of retreat, a skirmish that asked not whether, but when. Still, Thorin did not stir. Inside he walked the treasury alone, his boots making no sound on the gold-tiled floor. The reports had reached him curt, factual, dismissed. The battle was not at the gate, and so the king would not rise. He traced the edge of a helm once worn by his grandfather, and spoke to no one. The mountain was his, and all threats outside were echoes against its walls, but those echoes began to rise. By midday, a second wave struck the far watchposts. This time, the orcs came in tighter units, coordinated, moving under cover of terrain with a discipline that betrayed cunning beyond the crude. A pair of Lake Town sentries vanished. An elven captain returned with a blackened wound from a poisoned blade. Blood had been drawn now, and the valley knew it. Still, the armies did not clash in full. These were not yet the drums of war, but the fingers testing a lock before the strike. The orcs did not want the mountain yet. They wanted doubt. They wanted exhaustion. By nightfall, the camps had redrawn their borders. Fires were drawn inward. Commanders whispered instead of calling out. Horses were kept saddled. Scouts no longer went alone. Every path out from the valley was now watched. Among the elves, whispers passed of the wargs, shadow wolves bred for slaughter, their riders seen only in flicker, their howls swallowed by wind. Among the men, talk of Bol grew louder. They remembered tales of Azog and feared the sun might wield not only strength but strategy. Among the dwarves, talk was hushed entirely. They waited for Thorin to speak, but the mountain's king had grown more silent with each strike against the stone. That night, a lone orc was captured at the edge of the western slope, wounded and snarling. He spoke no tongue the men understood, but in his eyes flickered the kind of triumph that comes before siege. He did not beg, he did not tremble, he smiled. And from the northern passes, unseen in the night, the host gathered. No more scattered raiders, but ranks, discipline, signal torches. They would not strike tonight, but soon. The skirmishers had served their purpose. The defenders had been measured. The lines had been mapped, and inside Erebor, the gates remained sealed, the king's voice unheard, as if the mountain itself were listening for something larger still. From far above the valley, where the air thinned and the stone turned pale beneath the stars, the eagles watched. Their wings stretched silent across the night, great arcs of shadow gliding between cloud and cliff, eyes sharper than any steel drawn below. They did not intervene, not yet, but they bore witness to the slow, inevitable knitting of fate beneath them. The mountain, once a place of solitude and slumber, now pulsed with converging motion, armies gathering, tempers rising, and pride thickening like smoke before fire. To the eagles, the lines of movement were clear. From the north, a black tide poured through the secret ways, orcish ranks moving with grim patience, their war bands no longer fractured but fused into cohesion by something darker than loyalty. From the south, elves and men held their ground still, though their fires now burned smaller, their sleep light, and within the heart of the mountain, all was still, too still. But something stirred. One eagle, oldest among them, turned in slow descent toward the high ridges near Ravenhill, his wings slicing the wind with silent authority. He had seen the signs before in older wars, in ancient cycles, movements that looked like skirmish but were preludes to storms. It was not time to join the fray. It was time to understand what the world refused to see. Beneath his arc, Bard stood atop the hill behind his camp, scanning the horizon not as a soldier, but as a man searching for silence that no longer came. In his hand he held a broken shaft, one of the black-fletched arrows found near the western slope, its head poisoned, its design not crude but deliberate. "They're not testing us anymore," he said quietly. Beside him his captains looked out across the valley, their faces drawn. They're closing the circle. Threnduil had come the evening before, not in force but alone, cloaked in green and silver. He had not spoken until the fire crackled low, and even then it had not been a command, but an observation. If they mean to break us, they'll wait until unity crumbles first. That was the danger. Not the orcs themselves predictable in their ferocity, but the slow unraveling between elf, man, and dwarf. The alliance had never been spoken aloud. It hung in the air, a thing assumed and incomplete, and with every hour Thorin remained behind sealed gates. That assumption frayed further. In Erebor's upper watchtowers, Kili stood with a spyglass, his breath fogging the lens. He saw movement now each night, more than before, and close, and though the orcs had yet to strike in force, they had begun to leave signs, symbols etched into trees, crude skull totems planted near the slopes, warnings not aimed at the defenders, but at one another, territory claimed, assault planned. Still Thorin would not yield. The halls beneath the mountain rang with hammer blows and the clash of forging blades. The treasury had become an armory, and the king had begun to speak of coronation rites, of thrones made whole, of ancestors waiting to be honored. His words rang with conviction, but they echoed hollowly. The Arkenstone remained hidden. Not lost, not stolen. Hidden. Bilbo knew where. And each night he came closer to a decision he feared would tear what remained of their bond. The stone did not belong to Thorin, not as he had become. It belonged to the mountain, perhaps, or to no one. Outside, the wind turned colder. Scouts returned from the western path with grim faces. The passes once thought impassable had been cleared. Someone had done so from within. Paths were being prepared not for retreat, but for encirclement. It was in that same dusk that the eagle returned, high above Ravenhill, turning once, twice, and then vanishing eastward. But it had seen what it needed. The circle was closing. The forces were in place, and no one below could feel how little time remained before the veil of maneuver would give way to fire. In the valley the air thickened. Bows were restrung. Armor checked again. Words grew fewer. On both sides of the great gate, voices carried more weight, even in silence. And though no one said it, all knew. The next dawn would not come quietly. From within Erebor, Thorin watched the flickering light of distant fires from his high balcony. They burned low, scattered, careful. He mistook their quiet for weakness. He mistook the stillness of the valley for hesitation, and behind the last ridge, masked by the shape of the land and the soft curve of snow, the orc host stood ready. Their breath steamed like a rising forge, and their weapons gleamed without ceremony. They waited not for orders, but for the signal they already knew. The sky broke in silence. No trumpet, no heraldry, no call from the peaks, just motion, deliberate, immediate, and final. From behind the far ridges to the north and east, the black wave of the orc host descended like water poured down stone, endless and without pause. Beneath the veiled morning, where the frost still clung to tents and spears, the defenders looked up and saw the valley transform into war. It began as a murmur, distant boots upon frozen ground, the dull thunder of coordination. Then came the sound that would follow every heartbeat for hours, the drumming of iron against bone, of war chants rising from 1,000 mouths, shaped for violence. They advanced not in rage, but in rhythm, lines drawn with unnatural precision. At their center marched Bulg, his armor jagged and black, his helm crowned with the bones of beasts long dead. Bard was first to move. His signal was a single word, sharp and clear, and his men sprang to position. Shields locked, arrows notched, lines braced against the coming tide. They had drilled in expectation, not certainty. Now certainty arrived. From the woodline, Thranduil's warriors emerged like silver flame, flowing into formation without sound. The Elven King stood at their head, his expression unmoved, his sword unsheathed. He spoke no order. None was needed. His people knew what was required. The first clash came in a shower of black arrows, loosed from the ridges by orcish archers in staggered lines. The elves returned fire before the shafts struck earth, their arrows curving with preternatural grace, finding their marks as if guided by wind. Screams echoed from the slope, but the advance did not slow. On the western flank, the dwarves atop the battlements finally stirred. Dwalin raised his axe and shouted to those below, "They're not knocking, lads. Let's answer." But the gates of Erebor did not open. Thorin remained within. The valley trembled. The orcs struck the front lines of men and elves with the weight of floodwaters, relentless, faceless, unceasing. Bard's forces bent but did not break. Spears jabbed, shields groaned, arrows found lungs. At Thranduil's flank, the elves held the line like carved marble, yet the weight of numbers pressed against all rhythm. For every fallen orc, another came. Then another. A detachment of wargs broke from the left, snarling beasts ridden by lean orcs with scimitars drawn. They crashed into the lakemen's right flank, scattering archers and threatening to encircle. Bard leapt into the fray, his sword finding its mark even as his coat darkened with blood, not his own. Behind him, the remaining horsemen formed a wedge and drove back the riders with grim fury. But it was clear this was not a wave. It was a storm. From the mountainside, Fili and Kili watched with tight jaws. "They're dying down there," Kili said, voice low, eyes fixed on the chaos below. "And we do nothing." Balin stood behind them, silent. He did not answer because he could not. Still the gates did not open, and yet the defenders did not yield. The elves formed new lines, folding around broken ones like flowing water. The men of Lake Town regrouped behind makeshift walls of corpses and cartwood. They fought not for strategy now, but for survival and for one another. Then, amid the noise, the shape of the battlefield began to shift. A horn sounded low, rough, unfamiliar. From the ridgeline west of the main clash, a second orc column emerged, flanking the defenders with terrifying speed. Bolg had not committed all his forces at once. He had waited, he had planned. Panic rippled through the ranks. A full encirclement now threatened both man and elf. Even Thranduil's calm faltered. He raised his blade high, ready to fall with dignity if fall they must. But then, above them, the sky changed. A shadow passed over the battlefield, vast and slow. The orcs paused, not in fear, but in uncertainty. The Watchers of the Wind had returned. The eagles. They came not in multitude, but in precision, great forms descending from the heights in a spiral of wing and silence. They did not strike yet, but circled above, like omens carved in air, and with them came the whisper of something else. Still distant, still hidden, but moving toward the mountain's heart. Within Erebor, Thorin heard the echoes, not of battle, but of stone remembering flame. He stood now at the gate, alone, his hand upon the latch. The mountain waited. The earth shook. The battle had begun, but it was not yet decided. The clash deepened, and with it, the shape of the battle began to bend. The first hour had been noise and momentum, a flood of iron and fury, but now came the reckoning. The air was thick with ash and breath, cries lost beneath the thunder of marching boots and the clash of blade on blade. Beneath the mountain, the valley had become a crucible, and in it alliances and flesh alike were tested to the breaking point. Bard fought on foot now, his sword slick, his arm trembling from exertion. The men around him held fast, but they were thinning. Lines had blurred. The orcs had driven wedges through the flanks, separating companies, forcing combat into knots and whirlpools of desperation. Yet even in that confusion the men of Lake Town rallied to him, drawn not by command but by steadiness. He did not retreat, he did not call for aid, he simply stood, and so they stood with him. Thranduil moved like a shadowed flame, his blade never still, his face unreadable. His warriors folded around him, weaving formations in response to the tide. But even they began to feel the cost. For every orc that fell, 3 took its place. The Elven King turned his gaze toward the mountain more than once, not in hope but in warning. He did not call out, he waited. But time was being measured now in blood. Then a cry rose from the eastern slope, not of retreat but of fury. Dwarf. The gates of Erebor opened not with ceremony, but with force, stone grinding against itself in a long, cold breath. From the shadowed threshold stepped Thorin Oakenshield, armored in mail older than kingdoms, his eyes set like flint. Behind him poured the dwarves of the mountain, axes drawn, voices raised in the war chant of Dirin's line. Their charge struck the eastern flank like a hammerfall. The orcs reeled, caught between engagements, their formation broken by the sudden emergence of fury from the very heart of the stone. Thorin led the front himself, his sword cleaving with silent wrath, not a word spoken as he carved a path through the enemy's ranks. Above, from the cliffs of Ravenhill, Fili and Kili descended with their own company, sweeping behind the enemy line. Coordination returned. A new axis formed. Hope did not return, but rhythm did. Yet war is not won by appearance alone. The orcs regrouped, their captains barking orders, driving fresh ranks into the gaps. They adapted quickly. The dwarves fought with passion, but passion alone could not hold back the tide. Then came the first of the great duels. On the broken field near the riverbank, Dwalin met one of Bolg's lieutenants, a beast of scarred flesh and blackened blade. Their clash was not elegant, but absolute, 2 forms born for war, testing will through force alone. The elf archers gave them space. The orcs circled but did not interfere. Even in chaos, some rituals remained. Not far off, Keely led a defense around a wounded unit of Laketown men. He fought like wind in a bottle, swift and furious, holding his brother's side as they turned back yet another rush of blades. And still the battle swirled, with no center, no certainty. The eagles remained above, now joined by more of their kin. They circled, waiting, watching. They did not descend, not yet. In the midst of the chaos, Bilbo moved like a ghost, cloaked, unseen, untouched by blade or oath. He searched not for glory nor for death, but for meaning, something to anchor the unraveling. He had not spoken of the Arkenstone since the eve of battle, but now, watching Thorin wade through the blood of those who might have been allies, he understood what must come next. For all its valor, the battle was a tide, and tides turn. The defenders had not lost, but they had not won, not yet. Bolg himself had not entered the fray. He waited at the edge, surrounded by his black guard, watching with the same patience that had brought his armies here without being seen. He studied Thorin's path, his pace, his breath. He did not charge. He waited. He knew the mountain would come to him. The sun had reached its peak. The snow had begun to fall, soft and sparse at first, then thicker. It did not slow the war. It only muffled the sound, gave everything a strange quietness, as if the world itself were trying to hush what it could not stop. The battle had found its form, neither victory nor defeat, but balance held in teeth. And high above, the eagles began to turn again. Within the mountain, echoes moved where no footsteps fell. The forges, once roaring, now smoldered low, their fires dampened by absence. The vaults lay behind locked doors, heavy with wealth and silence. No clang of hammer, no chant of workers, only the soft groan of wind finding its way through ancient cracks in stone. Erebor, though now awake, had not yet spoken fully. It waited patient, poised, burdened with more than gold. Thorin walked its deepest corridors, alone. The cries of the battle beyond the gate had faded into the stone, dulled by distance and the weight of stone walls built for centuries. Yet he heard them not as sound, but as pressure. The mountain felt it too, a hum beneath his boots, a tension in the air. His path led him to the heart chamber, where once kings had stood beneath the mountain's crown, where torches did not burn, but lanterns of gem fire cast their light through mirrored halls. At the center stood the days, empty now, save for a cloth-wrapped bundle he had not touched in days. He approached it as one might approach a memory, unsure whether it would heal or harm. He unwrapped the Arkenstone. It pulsed faintly in the dim light, not glowing, not flickering, simply there, heavy, silent, beautiful beyond measure. And in its depth he saw not only the crown of his fathers, but the reflection of what he had become. The voices of the mountain whispered then, not words but warnings, not of orcs or armies, but of ruin that begins from within. Thorin clenched his jaw. This stone was his right, his proof, his claim. And yet, in the moment of reckoning, it offered no comfort, only clarity. Far above, the battle turned once more. The charge of the dwarves had shifted the balance. But Bolg had not been idle. His black guard now swept toward the mountain's base, cutting through the outer ring of defenders. Bard regrouped his men into a semicircle around the hill, anchoring their backs to the cliff face. The elves extended their line to cover the dwarven advance, but the strain was visible. Arrows grew scarce, blades dulled, breath shortened. Keely and Fili had reached the lower slopes of Ravenhill, where the fighting was fiercest. There the orc lieutenants had gathered, wielding blades forged in deep forges of the north. The brothers moved through the chaos with practiced rhythm, back to back, breath in time, their movements a song of kinship written in steel. But the tide grew heavier. A new push from the eastern flank forced the men of Lake Town to collapse inward. Bard called for retreat to the hilltop. The elves folded again, slower now, forming smaller knots of resistance. The dwarves, scattered and surrounded, began to splinter. Then, from the high western ridge, Bolg descended. He brought no vanguard, only himself and a shield-bearer, his eyes locked on the mountain gate. He moved not toward the heart of the battle, but toward its center, toward Thorin. The eagles circled lower. Their calls now pierced the air, sharp and rising. Still they did not strike. They watched. Inside Erebor, Thorin rapped the Arkenstone once more, but did not return it to its resting place. He turned, slowly, and walked back toward the gate. His steps were not hurried. There was no panic, no shout, only resolve. When he emerged once more onto the battlefield, the snow had deepened. It fell without wind, without sound, as if the sky wept gently for what was still to come. He descended with his guard to meet the front line. The warriors of all three realms, man, elf, dwarf, saw him not as king or claimant, but as anchor. His presence pulled the frayed edges of the field together. For a moment, a single breath of unity returned. Then Bolg struck. The Orc Lord came not with words, not with heraldry, but with weight. His charge cracked the stone beneath his boots, his blade drawn in silence. Thorin met him halfway. Their first clash rang like a bell across the valley. Around them the fighting paused. Not everywhere, not completely, but near, as if the field knew that something decisive had begun. And high above, the eagles turned their wings toward the mountain. The world had narrowed to the sound of steel. Thorin and Bolg met amid ruin, where the snow was trampled into mud and blood, where the echoes of the mountain turned hollow from the weight of battle. Their blades struck not as weapons, but as declarations, one for vengeance, one for legacy. Sparks leapt, fell, and died in the cold air. Thorin's sword, ancient and heavy, rang against Bolg's black edge, each clash reverberating through bone and frost. Bolg was larger, stronger, his strength drawn from the pits of ancient malice, but Thorin's endurance was carved from iron and exile. Every strike was measured, deliberate, every breath a memory of the long road from the Blue Mountains to this, his final stand before the gates of his home. Around them, the battle raged in widening circles. Bard's men fought shoulder to shoulder with the elves, a sight that in calmer years would have been unthinkable. Thranduil's archers fired from the slopes, their arrows cutting through the storm of orcish ranks that pressed toward the gate. But for every line broken, another formed. For every fallen foe, three took its place. The snow was blackened, and the valley's air had become a single pulsing breath of struggle. The dwarves had begun to falter. Dwalin, leading what remained of his guard, fought with furious defiance, his axe cleaving through armor as though through wood. Fili and Kili, higher upon Ravenhill, fought to cut through toward Thorin, their path a gauntlet of steel and chaos. They shouted his name, but their voices were lost in the roar of combat. Thorin struck low, twisting beneath Bolg's blow. The counter came like thunder. Bolg's gauntlet slammed into his chest plate, sending him staggering backward into the snow. For a breath, the king fell to one knee. Bolg raised his blade for the killing stroke, but Thorin's sword flashed upward, catching the blow, driving steel into wrist, into muscle, into the darkness beneath armor. Bolg's roar split the air, the sound of something vast and cruel wounded. For the first time, the reprieve was brief. Bolg lunged again, relentless, forcing Thorin backward toward the shattered stones at the mountain's base. Every motion felt heavier now. The strength that had driven him through exile and fire began to ebb. Yet he did not yield. There was no yielding left to him. He fought as though the mountain itself watched and demanded its price. Above, the eagles turned lower, their shadows crossing the snow in sweeping arcs. The wind shifted with their descent, a great whisper sweeping across the valley. Kili reached the slope first, his arm bloodied, his breath ragged. He saw Bolg towering over his uncle, saw the moment when one wrong step would end it. With no hesitation, he ran. His blade found its mark, slashing through the flank of the Orc Lord's armor. The blow did not kill, but it turned Bolg's attention. The counter came swift, a backhand strike, brutal, unthinking. Kili fell. Thorin's cry rose not in despair but in fury. The fury of every exile, every fallen kin, every oath bound to the weight of gold and stone. He struck once, twice, thrice. His final blow drove deep through armor, through flesh, through history. Bolg fell. The black helm split. The valley rang once and fell silent for the space of a heartbeat. The Orc host faltered. Their lines wavered, their rhythm broken. Then the sky erupted. The eagles descended. They came not as rescuers, but as reckoning, sweeping across the field in waves of golden wings, and cries that tore through the haze of war. They struck the rear lines, shattering ranks, scattering the disciplined formations that had held. What had been a siege became collapse. Bard raised his hand, rallying men to the charge. Thranduil advanced, his warriors cutting through the chaos like river light. The battle turned, not swiftly, but decisively. The tide that had seemed endless now began to withdraw, broken on the stone that would not fall, and yet amid victory there was no triumph. Thorin knelt beside Kili's still form, his sword fallen, his breath shallow. Snow fell softly on them both, covering the blood, the ruin, the history written in steel. Thele reached them, dropped his weapon, and sank beside his brother. No words passed. None were needed. The silence between them held what no song could name. Above, the eagles circled once more, their shadows long upon the snow. The sun broke weakly through the clouds, glinting off the mountain's crown. The wind carried away the last echoes of war, leaving behind only breath, only stillness, only the beginning of grief. The battle was ending, but the reckoning had just begun. The snow no longer fell. It drifted, soft, slow, quiet, as though the world itself had paused to breathe. The clash of war had ebbed into stillness. The ground, scarred and sodden, held no more charge, no more motion, only the weight of what had passed. Bodies lay where they had fallen, woven into the broken earth, their shapes indistinct beneath the gathering frost. Orcs and elves, dwarves and men, all silenced by the same hand, the same final chord of battle's refrain. Ravens circled slowly above, but even they did not descend yet. There was a waiting in the air as though the valley demanded silence before memory could begin. Thorin sat beneath a leaning rock near the base of Ravenhill, his back against stone, his breath shallow. His armor was cracked, blood dark at the seams. His eyes were half closed, turned not toward the mountain nor toward the dead, but to the sky, pale and open and without judgment. Fili and Kili were beside him, unmoving. The wind passed gently through their hair, lifting strands that would not rise again. Bilbo stood nearby, his cloak torn, his hands ungloved and raw. He had come too late to stop the fighting, too soon to escape the grief. He watched Thorin from a distance, unwilling to cross the space that lay between a king and the end of all things. At last he stepped forward. He knelt without speaking, not out of reverence, but out of knowing there were no words fit for such moments. Thorin turned his gaze, not with blame, not with warmth, only recognition. His mouth moved. The words came slow, as if pulled from a depth that could not be measured. "I was wrong." Bilbo bowed his head. The Arkenstone still rested within his satchel, untouched since he had offered it in secret. He did not speak of it. Not now. Thorin coughed once, the sound sharp against the quiet. "If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold," his voice faltered. He did not finish. He did not need. Bilbo reached for his hand and held it. Not tightly. Just enough to keep him there. Above them the mountain loomed, no longer a place of power or wealth, but of weight. Its halls, once filled with the sound of marching and forging, now held only memory. Elsewhere on the field, Thranduil walked among his fallen, his steps deliberate, his face unreadable. He spoke no words of mourning. He simply looked, and where he looked, the others followed, collecting their dead in silence. The Elven King's gaze passed once over the place where Thorin lay, but he did not approach. Some distances were not meant to be crossed, even in peace. Bard stood atop the slope, his sword planted in the earth, his hands clasped upon the hilt. The men of Lake Town stood behind him, many wounded, more grieving, all silent. He did not raise his voice, did not rally. He waited, as if waiting for the world to exhale. And when at last the sun crested the far rim of the valley, it came not as triumph, but as grace. The light was soft, golden through the mist, casting no harsh shadow. It fell upon the broken, the victorious, the fallen alike. It touched the mountain's face, glinting off stone and snow, warming the cold armor of the dead. The eagles, still circling, began to rise, one by one returning to their high homes. Their work was done. They had delivered justice, not favor. They had answered not the call of command, but the weight of necessity. Bilbo remained with Thorin until the breath beneath his ribs ceased. He closed the king's eyes gently, then rose, not as a hero, but as a witness. He walked slowly across the field, past broken spears and shattered helms, past the remnants of alliance and blood. He did not look back. He did not need to. The battle was over. But the mountain had not yet spoken its last. Within Erebor, the gold remained untouched. The Arkenstone, wrapped in cloth, was set at the foot of Thorin's bier, offered without ceremony, received by no one. It gleamed softly in the low firelight, not as a prize, but as a question that no longer had meaning. Outside the valley breathed. The wind shifted, and in that hush Middle-earth turned quietly toward whatever might come next. The dead had been carried from the field, one by one, in silence. No songs had risen, no horns had sounded, only the careful rhythm of feet upon snow, and the soft creak of carts drawn slow across the hollow ground. The mountain watched it all, unmoving, its gates open now not for war, but for mourning. Inside Erebor, torches were lit not for splendor but for passage. The grand hall had been cleared, gold pushed back into shadows, treasure covered in cloth. Where once the clang of forge and hammer had rung, now only soft voices remained. Priests of stone whispering rites in Husdil, the old tongue of the deep places. Their words carried not upward but downward, like water into the earth. Thorin lay at the center, clad in silver armor, a crown upon his brow. Fili and Kili rested beside him, their hands folded across their chests, their blades at their sides. They did not wear crowns. They had not lived to see such things placed upon them. but in the stone faces of the dwarves who gathered, there was no doubt they had been princes and more. Balin stood with Dwalin at the foot of the dais, eyes rimmed red, but posture unshaken. There was a weight in the air that neither could speak into. Behind them, the remnants of Thorin's company stood in stillness. Bofa, Bomba, Oin, Gloin, each marked in ash and wound, each silent with the kind of grief that has no center. Bilbo did not enter with the rest. He came late, stepping lightly, as though unsure if he belonged. No one stopped him. He walked the length of the hall alone, his cloak dragging behind him, torn and frayed. When he reached the bier, he removed his pack and laid it down beside the king. From it he drew the Arkenstone. He did not lift it high. He did not speak. He simply placed it at Thorin's feet, where it gleamed one last time in the torchlight before the cloth was drawn over them all. The dwarves would seal the tomb with stone and rune, as they had for generations. The mountain would hold its sons again. But first, the world outside needed tending. Bard and Thranduil met beyond the gate, neither carrying arms. Between them stood the valley, quiet now, though not yet healed. Their armies, diminished and bruised, had begun to dismantle their camps, to build fires not for war, but for warmth. "There will be songs," Bard said, his voice low, "but not yet." Thranduil's inclined his head. "You have lost much." "So have you." Neither sought to measure grief. There was no weight for such things, but something had shifted between them. They had stood together. They had fought without oath and bled without contract. Now, in the silence, something like peace had begun. The elves would return to the woodlands, their dead carried upon shields of cedar. The men of Lake Town would rebuild, not their old town, but a new place, closer to the mountain upon ground not scorched by dragon fire. Bard had refused the treasure Thorin had once withheld, accepting only what would feed and clothe and shelter those who had survived. There was no debt between them now, only understanding. Bilbo watched from a distance. He had not spoken much since the end. His words felt out of place in halls of echo and ash. But as the days passed, he found small tasks to occupy his hands, repairing cloaks, tending fires, mending torn maps. No one asked him to stay. No one asked him to leave. On the 7th morning after the battle, he gathered his belongings, wrapped his cloak tighter, and stood before the gate. Balin met him there, his beard neater now, though his eyes still carried the shadow of farewell. "You'll go west," Balin said. "Back to the Shire." Bilbo nodded. "It's time." Balin held out a small parcel wrapped in cloth, bound in leather. "It's not treasure," he said. "Just food and ink. For the journey." Bilbo smiled. It was a quiet smile, full of things not said. He took the parcel, slung it over his shoulder, and began down the winding path from the mountain. He did not look back until he reached the river. There he turned once and saw Erebor in the morning light, still immense, still proud, but no longer unreachable. It stood not as a fortress now, but as a memory, a place where things ended, a place from which new stories would begin. He turned again and walked west. The mountain no longer echoed. Its halls were still, its fires banked low, its vaults sealed in solemn hush. Outside, the valley stirred with quiet purpose. What war had torn open, hands now sought to mend. Tents were folded, watchfires doused, wounds dressed, graves dug. It was not peace, not yet, but something older and deeper, recovery. From the ruined slopes, paths were being cleared. Rubble was moved stone by stone, not by decree but by will. Elves worked beside men, lifting beams, steadying carts. The dwarves of Erebor, fewer now, emerged from the inner halls in silence and returned to labor. Not as craftsmen of gold, but as caretakers of memory. Bard walked among them, his cloak dark with soot, his sword sheathed. He gave no orders. He listened. He placed hands on shoulders, offered words that did not carry upward but settled into hearts. In the shadow of the mountain, he had become something more than the slayer of a dragon. He had become a steward of aftermath. Lake Town would rise again, not as it was, but as it must become. Plans were sketched on torn parchment, supply lists etched into frost-glazed boards. Stones were marked for foundations near the river mouth, far enough from the old ruins, but close enough to remember. The people had not asked to be remade, but the fire had done so, and now they moved forward because there was no other direction. Thranduil did not linger. On the third morning after the pyres, he gathered his host. Their journey would be long, and their silence longer. Yet before he departed, he stood once more at the gate of Erebor, where stone met snow, and spoke with Dwalin in the language of shared respect. No treaty was signed, no formal alliance forged, but a look passed between them. A look that said, "We were enemies, then comrades, now something else." The forest would remember. The mountain would not forget. In the mountain's depths, Thorin, Fili, and Kili were entombed beneath a new vault. The chamber was carved not with dragons or gold, but with runes of kinship, of sacrifice, of silence. Their names were etched beside their ancestors, but lower, closer to the earth. They had not ruled long, they had not ruled in peace, but they had stood when it mattered, and in that standing, they had become part of the mountain itself. The Arkenstone was placed atop the tomb, set in stone, not lifted into air. It would not be worn, it would not be wielded. It was no longer a crown, it was a memory. Bilbo had lingered longer than he expected. Each morning he meant to leave, and each morning he found some reason to stay. A small task undone, a farewell not spoken. He walked the halls slowly, touching walls carved with unfamiliar stories, pausing before doorways that opened into vast, empty chambers. He thought often of Thorin's last words, not the apology, but the wish that the world value quiet joys above hoarded wealth. Bilbo carried that sentence like a stone in his pocket, warm and unpolished. He did not speak of it, he simply carried it. When at last he left, he did so without ceremony. He walked down the valley path with only his pack and his walking stick, his head bowed beneath a sky that was clear and pale. The eagles had long since gone. The horns of war had been silenced. Only the river moved now, its current slow, steady, as though time itself had resumed. He passed through the remnants of the camps, nodded to guards who did not know his name, paused beside a fire where a child hummed an old song in a new voice. And then he crossed the ridge, where the mountain became distant behind him, and the road bent toward the west. No one followed, no one called him back. From the heights of Erebor, Balin watched his small figure shrink into the horizon. He said nothing. Dwalin came and stood beside him, arms folded, eyes narrowed against the wind. "He'll write it all down, won't he?" Dwalin said. Balin nodded. "Aye, but not for gold, not for legacy, just because it happened." The wind shifted. Snow began to fall again, light, uncertain, harmless. It covered the scars, softened the trenches, draped itself across memory like a veil. The mountain stood quiet, vast, and unchanged. But somewhere, across hills and forests and rivers, yet to Thor, a hobbit walked home, carrying a tale the world would one day need. In the soft hush of early spring, when snow had begun to loosen its hold on the hills and the rivers sang just a little louder each morning, the scars of war faded into memory. Grass returned to the battlefields, tentative and thin at first, but green nonetheless. The stone was still cracked in places, and the earth bore the weight of what had been lost, but the land, as always, began to heal without permission. Erebor stood unchanged in outline, its crown of rock rising unchallenged into the clouds. But its spirit had shifted. The gold no longer shimmered so freely from its halls. It was not hidden, but it was no longer revered. It had been weighed and found wanting. Now it rested behind sealed doors, untouched, its presence more reminder than treasure. Balelon took to walking the lower halls, not as a guard, nor as a lord, but as a keeper of silence. He often passed through the memorial chamber without pause, letting his fingertips graze the edges of stone runes as he passed. The tombs were sealed, the voices quiet, but the weight of them lingered, not heavy, not mournful, just present. Above, Dwalin resumed the training grounds, guiding the younger dwarves, not in war, but in readiness. "Not all battles are fought with blade," he told them. "But you'll hold one true when the time comes, and that will be enough." The mountain, for the first time in years, knew routine again. Outside, Bard's people built homes that would not burn. The stone was quarried from old ruins, the beams raised with the care of those who knew loss. Dale did not yet stand tall, but it stood, and that was no small thing. Bard himself worked among them, sleeves rolled, hands calloused. He met ambassadors from distant lands with dignity, but never show. When asked for titles, he simply replied, "I'm a man of this valley." That's title enough. Thranduil did not return, though his scouts did. Quiet figures moved in and out of the forests, ensuring no shadow rose anew. They brought small gifts, medicines, preserved fruit, seeds. Each time they left without explanation. The bond remained unspoken but held. And from the west, when spring had fully come and the snows had fled the lower hills, a letter arrived. It was small, sealed in plain wax, addressed to Balin by a hand both tidy and unpretentious. He opened it alone, seated by a narrow window that overlooked the first blooming trees beyond the mountain's edge. The letter was brief. It spoke of quiet days in the Shire, of a garden planted and thriving, of a hole in the hill once emptied, now filled again with books and buttons and peace. It spoke nothing of gold, nothing of war, only of breakfasts taken slowly and walks without urgency. Balin smiled. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer beside old maps and faded sketches. He would not answer. The words had already done enough. From that point forward, the story of the Battle of Five Armies passed into something quieter. Not forgotten, but no longer raw. Songs were sung, yes, but they were not anthems of glory. They were low, slow, and reverent. Ballads of choice, of pride, of the moments when fire and ice met beneath the mountain's gaze. In years to come, travelers would pause on the slopes near the battlefield. Though little remained to see, the grass would cover the blood, the stone would forget the breaks. But those who knew the stories felt something in the air, a hush, a kind of breath held between memory and sky. Children born after would ask about the mountain, why it stood alone, why its gates were watched, but never feared. And their elders would tell them, simply, because once everyone came, and once everyone left. Not all of them, they would whisper, but enough. And so the valley endured, not in triumph, but in rhythm. Each spring, the snow melted a little sooner. The riverbanks thickened with wildflowers. The stones warmed beneath the rising sun, and in the heart of the mountain, beneath gold that no longer glittered, beneath stone that no longer wept, the names remained carved deep, lit only by torchlight, guarded by silence. There was no crown left to wear, but there was peace, and in the end that was the greater inheritance.